Oh hey, didn't see you there. Just give me a minute whilst I grab this guy's liver. There we go. Thanks for waiting. In the last video on this channel, we took a look at the core mechanics of Pathologic 2, exploring how they make it such a harrowing and unique experience to play through, and why it's probably a crime to recommend anyone actually try it themselves. One of my goals with that video was to try and give anyone new to the Pathologic universe a bit of insight into the series, to explain the appeal of its gameplay for the small number of mutants like myself who actually enjoy it, and perhaps even get them intrigued enough to consider playing it themselves. So far, that video has done a lot better than I expected, and a couple of folks even mentioned in the comments that they checked it out after seeing what I had to say. I'm really happy that they did, though my lawyers would like me to note that legally, I can't be held liable for the consequences. It's for this reason that I didn't delve all that deeply into the game's plot during that video, as I didn't want to spoil too much of the story before giving any viewers a chance to experience it themselves. Today though, I'm going to be taking a different approach, examining the world, characters and central plot of Pathologic 2, along with the interesting moments where the latter intersects with the brutal gameplay. I'm also going to be recapping a fairly complete version of Pathologic 2's main storyline in the process, so if you're daunted by the idea of actually playing it after everything I said in the last video, you'll at least get to see the more interesting parts of the game without putting yourself through it. I'm going to warn though that this is going to be far from a comprehensive breakdown of everything that happens in the game, so if you want to see its really deep lore, then I guess you'll just have to play it for yourself. I'm sorry. In theory, this also means that you could watch this video if you haven't seen the previous one and still get a lot from it, but I'd recommend that you go back and give it a watch if you want to understand the full context of the struggle that the game's story plays out against. To give everyone a refresh on the events we did cover last time, in Pathologic 2 you play as the Haruspex Artemy Burak, a young man who spent the last few years studying medicine away from his hometown. One day you receive a letter from your father Isidor, a doctor himself, asking you to return home and assist him in his duties now that he's growing old. This brings you back to the town on the Gorkon River, an isolated steppe village that's full of weird monuments, weird buildings, and weirder people. On arriving back home though, you discover that Isidor isn't just getting old, he's also dead, killed by a stab wound to the chest sometime the morning before you arrived. After squabbling with the town's leaders for the first 2 in-game days and trying to establish your own innocence in his murder, life in the town gets upended when a deadly plague breaks out in the district around your father's house. The town gets placed under quarantine by the mysterious authorities of the powers that be. Its leadership quickly becomes overwhelmed, and it's clear that you're going to have to go it alone to find both Isidor's killer and a cure for the disease now raging in the streets. The two might even be connected, as on attending your father's funeral and examining his body, you note that he was already suffering from an illness at the time of his death, and had dirt under his fingertips for some unknown reason. Along the way, you're assisted in theory by 2 other doctors, Daniel Dankovsky, also known as the Bachelor, and the changeling Clara, a young girl who claims to have a miraculous healing touch. I say in theory because they're both crap at it, but we'll talk more about them later. Under the guidance of a strange stepwoman named Aspity, you quickly discover that Artemy's father wasn't a conventional doctor. Instead, he was what is known as a Menku or warden, a folk practitioner who brewed medical potions using local herbs named Twire. On day 2, you gain access to the Lair, a base left behind by your father where you can brew these immunity-boosting tinctures yourself, and which quickly become your main way of keeping both yourself and the rest of the town's inhabitants safe from the plague. As you start down this path, you also realise that your father held a leadership position within the kin. This group of formerly nomadic cattle herders now work as slaughtermen in the town's all-consuming bull enterprise, subjugated under the iron rule of Big Vlad. Some of them are recognisably human, some of them very much aren't, and others seem to float somewhere in between. These people worship the earth in the form of the deity Mother Bodho, to whom they attribute Twire and all of the region's miracles. This extends to the point where they believe that the surrounding steppe is literally alive, and that it requires the dancing of steppe women known as herb brides to guide and nourish it, along with regular offerings of blood. After interacting with them and Aspity for a couple of days, it becomes clear that they expect Artemy to take up his father's mantle, though you'll have to prove yourself worthy before you can assume his position as warden. This means re-establishing Artemy's relationship with his steppe ancestry, learning the inner workings of the kin and resolving its internal and external conflicts. On top of all this, you also find out that before his death, your father had been taking a particular interest in some of the town's children, on whom he felt the town's fate rested, along with a strange step symbol known as the Udurg. After talking to Aspity and other kin members, you discover that in their language, it means a big body, or perhaps a body that contains many things. It's also linked to the kin's primordial bull god Boss Turok, whose body is indeed said to comprise the world. So on top of your other goals, you also have to try and keep these kids alive, and to discover the true identity of the Udurg. Throughout this all, the game warns you that you only have until the 12th in-game day to find a cure for the plague, and that little time already seems to be speeding up. Last time, we left off around the beginning of day 4, by which point players will have explored most of the town and gotten a grasp on how all the game's various characters and factions relate to one another. Up until this point, the game resembles a pretty faithful remake of the first part of the Haruspex playthrough of Pathologic 1, with updates to its mechanics and a little elaboration and meta-commentary on its events. A good parallel for anyone who's played it is how the Final Fantasy VII Remake expands on the plot and gameplay of the first part of the original game, though without as much filler. But whilst much of the game's wider lore remains functionally the same as in Pathologic 1, as it progresses, we begin to see its events diverge from those of its predecessor, to examine Artemy's relationship with the kin and his deceased father's legacy, along with his sense of responsibility towards the town. The earliest signs of this divergence, though, can be seen in how the physical world of Pathologic 2 is constructed. As I discussed in the last video, when you start exploring the open world of the town, the first things that stick out are the series staples. On one side you have the Polyhedron, a nightmarish construct built by the utopian Cain family as part of their efforts to transcend base humanity, and which is said to be capable of holding dreams and even souls. On the other side, and seemingly in opposition to it, you have the abattoir, the town's mouldering heart-shaped slaughterhouse and an ancient temple of the kin. Outside of these though, much of the town has a distinct tone and character, one that little resembles that of Pathologic 1. Where the original game relies on abstraction and a deliberate sense of discontinuity in portraying its world, Pathologic 2 instead opts for a more unified and realistic approach, one that comes with pros and cons. And to show what I mean by this, let's talk a little about how the game looks. On a surface level, Pathologic 2 looks fine. It's nothing compared to any AAA production of the last 5 years, but it's light years ahead of Pathologic 1. That's not really a fair comparison given the 14-year difference in technology, but what I find more interesting than 2's improved graphical fidelity is the difference in world design between the two games. In Pathologic 1, the town just doesn't make that much sense. Alongside its ancient step monuments and incomprehensible utopian architecture, you've also got things like buildings from mismatched time periods, guns that look like they were manufactured from anywhere between the 1800s to the 1930s, and a wild mixture of modern and archaic-looking clothing styles. To me, it feels very obviously constructed, a vague facsimile of a town that's been slapped together by a force that doesn't really comprehend the subtleties of how all this stuff is supposed to mesh together. If you've made it to one of the game's hidden endings, then you'll know just how true this is. This really helps enhance the alien feel the game instills in the player, like there's some sort of unknowable entity or entities lurking behind the thin curtain of the game. By comparison, the vibe that Pathologic 2's design gives me is more of an encroaching, almost Lovecraftian sense of unease and decay. In this game, things feel a lot more cohesive. Everything has a similar art style, most of the buildings look dilapidated, and there's just this overwhelming sense of rot. Instead of alien disorder, the whole town feels like it's slowly decomposing. This ties into the conflict between it and the ways of the kin that starts to build during the later portions of the game. You can feel the earth striving to throw off the buildings that have been imposed upon it, slowly crumbling their bricks and mortar in a desperate attempt to reverse the rigors of modernity. The old step monuments dotted around the town are similarly decrepit, but to me it's more a feeling of the weight of age, like they've been here for an incomprehensibly long time, and if the earth has its way, they'll remain here long after the town itself is gone. It all works really well from a storytelling perspective, but unfortunately it also means a lot of the time the game looks like a fairly drab brown sandbox. This difference in tone also extends to the game's music. Pathologic 1's soundtrack is excellent, eclectic, and continues to reinforce the alien feeling of its world. Its composers drew on a wide blend of Eurasian influences, and there are many tracks that are appropriately unnerving and atmospheric. Some, however, are just outright strange both in their composition and placing. This is one of the safest places in the game, by the way. Most of Pathologic 2's soundtrack instead consists of these muted, droning tracks that give off a vague sense of unease, along with the occasional feeling that there's something lurking unseen beneath Artemy's feet. Which is also true some of the time. For some reason, the word muddy came to mind when reflecting on it. Now there are still a few standout pieces. For example, I really like the music that plays whenever you visit the lair. It's not that exciting, but it's nice to just have this sort of downbeat and homey theme to listen to whenever you visit. It helps enhance the feeling of your base being a safe place to take a break from the chaos outside. There's still a little element of menace in there, so you can't relax entirely, but in this game, I'll take anything I can get. Where things get really cool is that they also use the same central melody in one of the tracks that plays whenever you're out wandering in the steppe at night. In this version, there's more of a wild edge to it though, which somehow makes what is basically a featureless grassland feel alive and vibrant. The similarity of this theme to that of one of the few safe places in the town led me to also increasingly see it as a safe zone, a feeling I'd argue parallels Artemy's attempt to reconnect with his steppe ancestry. This led to me falling into a pattern where I'd set aside a bit of time each night just to wander the steppe, decompress, and hunt for twire. By the end of the game, it's hard not to see spending time in this place as more appealing than dealing with the horrors of the town. Yeah, there might be a lot less going on out here, but it's also a place where you feel secure and free of the plague, and all of Artemy's obligations to protect the townsfolk. Outside of this, I also like how the bar theme is a homage to the bar theme from Pathologic 1. It's not as good as the original, but it helps give a sense of continuity between the two games. I'd still say Pathologic 1's soundtrack is the more consistently good of the two, though honestly neither of them are exactly the type of soundtrack that I would go out of my way to listen to outside of playing the game. Now, this all might make it sound like I dislike how Pathologic 2 does its design and atmosphere, but I want to stress that there are elements that I really love. For example, some parts of the soundtrack might just be alright, but the sound design outside of it is great. Whether it's the uncomfortable creaking sounds of the lockpicking, the weird discordant sounds that play when you're wandering around the town, or the way that the shotgun blast sounds like it's whacking Artemy in the chest with its recoil every time you fire it, it all helps make everything you're doing feel more visceral and unnerving. There's also times where it and the visuals of the game all come together to make some incredibly effective scenes. Consider the opening scene at the train yard. Here the graphics, lighting and ambient music come together to produce one of the most atmospheric sights you'll see in a game. There's weird plant matter hanging in the air, the gloom of the factories in the distance, the searchlights piercing through it. It's so well done. It really gives you a sense of foreboding as you start to explore the town. A lot of the credit for this has to go to the lighting system, which looks great at both dawn and sunset. And whilst we're on the topic of the game's graphics, something I also love about Pathologic 2's design is how they chose to depict the character models. Rather than aiming for pure realism, the characters have this slightly cartoony deformation to them. In addition to making them look more appealing, it also makes them look slightly doll-like, which if you're aware of the lore around Pathologic 1's endings, is an interesting choice. Back to the story, after being introduced to the plague and the ways of the Menku, Artemy spends the next couple of days trying to find a cure. To do this, you try out a number of different tinctures, including ones mixed with both healthy and diseased organs, which I acquired through, legitimate means? After trying them out on some, I'm gonna go with volunteers? You find out that these do work as antibiotics and painkillers, sometimes, but they don't cure the plague. With the Bachelor's assistance, you also discover that bulls are immune to the plague, but any potion made from their blood is more likely to kill someone than cure them. Instead, Artemy becomes convinced that what he needs is the blood of a chimera, a miraculous creature that combines the properties of both a human and a bull. How are you supposed to find such a thing, you ask? Good question. As for who killed your father, you do manage to dig up some leads. After completing a few missions, you discover that the night before he died, your father was seen in the company of Simon Kane, head of the utopian Kane family and another of the town's elders, who was also found dead the same morning. Together they went out into the steppe, where they dug a hole in the earth for some unknown reason. The only person who might know more is a man named Overseer Tycheek, who followed them into the steppe. Later he also returned to the town, but unfortunately both he and the majority of the kin have been locked up on Big Vlad's orders in a vast set of stone dormitories known as the Termitary, supposedly to head off some sort of seasonal riot that was threatening to break out. To make matters worse, you're also no closer to figuring out the true nature of the Udurg on Isidor's list. Eventually you also learn that the head of the kin, Foreman Oyun, might know more about it, but he's presumably been locked up in the Termitary alongside Tycheek. You can argue with its guards to let you in, try begging Big Vlad or his weird son Vlad Jr. to open its doors, but you're out of luck. It's going to take someone far more powerful to get the old Gimskis to bend. By the time you reach the end of day 5 then, you're beginning to get desperate. You're almost halfway through the time that you're told you have to fix all this, and despite talking to most of the townsfolk, you've come up with nothing. All you need is a single break, for just one person to let slip a crucial lead that will crack open either your father's murder case or give you some clue as to how to cure the plague. Unfortunately for you though, that's not happening, not with the characters in this game. Yeah, the characters in Pathologic 2 are both interesting and interesting. In Pathologic 1, many of the characters were notorious for talking in an inscrutable manner. Here they aren't quite as cryptic, but they're still far from forthright. It feels like I'm dealing with a variant of the old Two Guards riddle, where half the characters are straightforward with you but don't know anything useful, whilst the other half do know some of the stuff Artemy needs, but mostly speak in riddles. This makes every conversation seem like you're conducting an interrogation, a feeling accentuated by how the game blacks out the rest of the world whenever you're talking to someone. And you're right to treat these conversations that way. Almost everyone in the town either has a strange agenda that conflicts with Artemy's goals, or a terrible secret that they're trying to hide. This is impressive, considering that there's plenty of people you don't really interact with much outside of trying to keep them safe from the plague. This might make it seem like the game has lots of NPCs just for the sake of making it difficult to keep them all alive, and yeah, sort of. Some of this is probably a legacy of the game's original conception, where the developers intended to have 3 separate playthroughs, with each player character interacting the most with the NPCs who align with their goals, only for the developers to have to cut it down to just the Haruspex route in order to get the game out at all. The ones you do talk to at length though are all well written and give you a sense of being deep, complex people with conflicting philosophies and agendas. A lot of them are just outright fun to interact with, particularly some of the kids on your father's list. You've got Sticky, a thieving orphan who you catch breaking into the lair, and who acts as sort of the Haruspex's sidekick and surrogate son. There's Notkin, a local ruffian who speaks in riddles, and who leads a gang that believe they have 1.5 souls. Yeah, don't ask, I could talk for like half an hour on these guys alone. There's also Grace, another orphan who can talk to the dead, even though it's slowly killing her, and Capella, Big Vlad's daughter and a budding prophet who warns that blood follows in Artemy's footsteps. My personal favourite though is Murky. She's yet another orphan kid who, according to the game's design documents, has autism, who first shows up as a surprise witness to vouch for your innocence in your father's murder. And some actual murders you sort of really did. It's okay though, it was self-defense. After that, she starts to appear whenever you return to the lair, where she makes friends with Sticky and starts to treat him like a brother. If you interact with her though, she mostly talks about how she hates Artemy and how there's nothing about him to love. It's clear though after talking to her for a while that there's something more going on here. We'll get to it. Outside of these kids, what I find especially cool is that you sometimes see hints of deeper things going on with the characters that you don't interact with as much. To me, the best example of this is Anna Angel. At first glance, Anna is nothing special. She's introduced as an eccentric former gymnast, who one of the other characters asks you to look in on during the plague and see how she's holding up. Here you learn that she's a germaphobe with a bad reputation, and sort of a childlike mentality, but that's about it. Later on in the game, once the plague districts show up, you get the option of trying to save abandoned babies from infected houses. This is really dangerous, but doing so gets you a cash reward and a reputation boost, as well as the satisfaction of, saving a baby. If you do this a couple of times though, you discover Anna creeping around the infected houses, claiming that she's trying to do the same thing in order to improve her reputation, and wearing this creepy as hell theatre makeup while she's at it. The thing is though, this woman is a monster. You can go the whole game without realizing it, but if she gets infected with the plague, she breaks down and tells you that she used to run with the Ace of Diamonds caravan, a crew of child abductors masquerading as circus performers. She was the bait too, the star performer who distracted the crowd whilst the rest of the caravan picked out the handsomest kids to steal. Some of those kids got turned into performers, some got sold on, and others, well, if we go by the story in Pathologic 1, the caravan's leaders got the death penalty when the powers that be caught up with them. This left me honestly conflicted when she fell sick. Like, yeah, I wanted to save everyone in my playthrough, but is she really worth saving? She does act remorseful over her past actions, but that's the point. She's acting. I know this because if you take the time to grill her on her intentions for the baby, then she admits that she's actually planning to sell it to a mysterious group in return for a drug that they claim protects against the plague. Apparently they make this drug using the babies, and no one says outright what that entails, but come on, that can't be good. If you've played Pathologic 1, you also know that the things I've described here are only the tip of the iceberg compared to the things she's accused of doing in that game. What makes her especially dangerous though is that she's not just your average self-interested person who's harming the rest of society to increase their power or further an agenda that you might be able to reason with or bribe in some fashion. She's the special sort of monster who operates purely on an instinctual level, who acts only to secure their own needs and survival, and who is incapable of understanding how her actions might harm others. I don't even know how you could protect society from someone like that. What I'm trying to say is that Anna is no angel. In any other game, this woman could be a major villain, but in a cast as fleshed out as Pathologic 2's, she's a minor side character. This should give you some indication as to the depth of the writing in this game. Despite this, there are a couple of ways in which I think the game drops the ball a little with its characters, though the first of these is something that was probably out of the developer's hands. This is that the game's characters don't really do anything. I don't mean that they don't play a role in the plot, they certainly talk about all the things they've been doing, but all their actions conveniently take place whenever you're not around. About the biggest change you ever see is that sometimes an NPC will move location, or sometimes you get to see 2 or more NPCs meeting. You rarely ever actually get to see them moving or talking though, they just happen to get there and complete their conversation a few minutes before you arrived. My first thoughts were that this is a bit disappointing, but after considering the financial restrictions the game had, I'm glad they just made the game like this instead of trying to make something more complex that probably would have ended up looking worse. This enhanced visual novel style of storytelling might make the game feel a little less dynamic at times, but it forces them to fall back on the quality of the writing, which is excellent. They do occasionally play a few tricks with the style as well, like suddenly shifting a character's position to catch you by surprise. It also inadvertently makes the incredibly small number of scenes where characters actually talk to one another feel a lot more impactful. Another element of the game that I feel underdelivers is how it treats the other player characters from the original game, the Bachelor Daniel Dankovsky and the Changeling. They also get dropped into the plot alongside the Haruspecs and pursue their own agendas. In Pathologic 1, this meant squabbling with each other, siding with opposite factions, and either accidentally or deliberately thwarting the player's attempts to deal with the outbreak. In each case, you felt like they were still playing major roles in the plot outside of the actions of whoever you were playing at the time. In Pathologic 2, you're again tasked with working with them to cure the plague, and I was looking forward to seeing how their resulting conflicts would play out. This didn't really happen. You do check in with the Bachelor several times early in the game, where, well, he mostly just acts like a prick. True to the first game, he's the big city bachelor of medicine, full of contempt for these provincials with their backwater superstitions. He does help you find a vital clue for curing the plague, but in the second half of the game, he quietly vanishes from the plot. He shows up again right at the end to fuck you over, great work Dankovsky, but other than that he's just stood in the town hall doing nothing. The changeling does show up a few more times, but she mostly just calls Artemy a ripper and talks ominously about how he's doomed to spill a river of blood. Why do people keep saying things like that? You're not sure if she's trying to help you, destroy you, or even if there's more than one of her. There is one kinda cool moment though, where she shows up and seems to be either menacing or trying to protect one of the kids on your father's list. If you keep talking to Murky, she does seem to warm up to you a little, though she still argues with Sticky as to whether there's anything to like about Artemy. After a while, she also starts to show up around the town, talking about a mysterious friend of hers, and eventually invites you out into the steppe to meet this friend in the dead of night. If you show up, it's revealed to be the Changeling, or Changelings, or possibly the Plague taking her form to trick you. Whoever she is, she presents you with a choice. Either let Murky die or get infected with the Plague yourself. Obviously it's your choice to make as you see fit, but I just want you to know that if you let this little girl die, we are not friends and you are never invited to my birthday party again. If you choose to get infected, then you get to hear the voice of the Plague as you stumble back home. It's about as ominous as you would expect, trying to convince you to give in and embrace it instead of continuing to fight.
Foeless. Foeless. Why be foes? Why shun? Better to listen than to fight. Abiding and watchful is wisdom.
You can also check in with Murky afterwards to see if she's alright. She seems okay, though she refuses to come back to the lair, preferring to stay in an old boxcar out by the station. Okay kid, just do me a favour and remember to eat something once in a while. This side quest in itself is an interesting little moment in the gameplay, but that's all it is, one 20-minute quest where you get a brief glimpse at the duality of the Changeling as a character. Other than that, she's basically not a factor in most of the game. On the surface, this might also seem like a Pathologic 1 style fuck you moment that infects you with the Plague, but as we'll see, it lines up pretty well with you finding a potential cure, so it's more like a chance to use yourself as a guinea pig. Outside of the NPCs, there's another major character that we should talk about, Artemy. Yeah, I haven't really talked about this at all yet, but the game does give you a little bit of leeway in how you want to play him through the dialogue options. Whatever you choose though, most of these options paint a picture to me of a pragmatically minded man, who is often far more concerned with results than questioning the methods he has to resort to if they work. Depending on your choices, he might be a man who's polite and straight to the point, frustrated and straight to the point, or outright rude and insulting, whilst also being straight to the point. He's not above going along with the weird ramblings of other figures though, especially if he thinks he has something to gain from it. Another way that they let you characterize him is in how he interacts with the town's stranger inhabitants. Using the kin as an example, you can choose to embrace them, accepting your father's legacy as a Menku and applying yourself to learning their teachings. You're equally free, however, to reject this role, refusing to take on Isidor's earthly burdens and having his body burned instead of buried to mark a clean break with the past. From there you can ignore the kin entirely if you like, denouncing their teachings as superstitious nonsense and refusing to entertain Aspety's ideas of you assuming your father's role. If you wait long enough without talking to her, then she eventually dies and you're forced to figure out the rest of the plot without her. Unfortunately though, Artemy does have something of a fixed role in this story. So you might be free to ignore the kin's teachings and try to find your own way of solving the outbreak, but you're probably not going to get very far in the plot if you do. The result is that you can disdain the kin's teachings a little, so long as you end up following them. Speaking of solving the outbreak, by day 6 things are starting to get pretty desperate for Artemy. You've exhausted all your materials for finding a cure, Big Vlad is still refusing to let you or anyone else inside the termitary, and to make matters worse, word is getting around that the powers that be have dispatched an inquisitor to the town to deal with the outbreak. These individuals are entrusted with extraordinary power to solve problems by any means necessary, and understandably most of the townsfolk are worried by the draconian measures their arrival will herald. Then, right as hope seems to be running low, Artemy has a dream. He finds himself in a room full of stepfolk hidden deep in the bowels of the termitary, one that echoes with the screams of what sound like dying men and women. Here a young step-girl introduces herself as Tyre Tycheek, one of the children on your father's list, and the daughter of the overseer who may hold the secret as to what happened the night that Isidor died. Unfortunately, she doesn't know where he is either, but before the dream ends, she tells Artemy the only thing about the Udurg she knows, a poem pertaining to an old village in the steppe about blood seeping from the Udurg's ear. It's not much to go on, but you're out of options. After trekking all the way out there, you do indeed find a rock formation in the shape of an ear. From it leaks a small pool of blood which resembles that of no known creature, which seems unmistakably alive. If you collect some of it and take it back to the lair to brew, the resulting substance is unlike any of the antibiotics you produced before. Instead, what Artemy holds in his hands is a true panacea. Finally, you have a cure to the plague. To herald this development, the plague appears to you in the guise of a bird-like executor once again. This time though, its tone is different. No longer able to dismiss your abilities, it now chastises you as a short-sighted fool, describing itself as a heavenly gift and the panacea in your hands as a poison that you should reject. Clearly you've got this thing rattled. There's only one problem though. You've no idea where to get more of the blood you need to make your cure. Then on day 7, everything begins again. That morning the Inquisitor arrives in town, and she's kinda scary.
I wanted to apologize for the lie. I did, but still, I'd lied. Betrayed his trust.
Betrayal means death. Next.
I cheated on my wife, but thing is, we've been together for...
Cheating is betrayal. Betrayal means death. Please stand to the left. Next.
This is reinforced when you're first summoned to meet her. After taking up residence in the town's imposing cathedral, the first thing she does is order a gallows constructed. This structure welcomes you on the way in, and sets the tone for your dealings going forward. As you enter, you also pass a queue of the town's notables, now reduced to supplication before Glaya Lilich in fear of their lives. Thankfully you have the panacea to show her, so she grants Artemy a reprieve from the noose, though she's not impressed when you tell her that you don't know where to get the materials to make more. Desperate to find more of the strange blood, you head back to the abandoned steppe village where you obtained it. You don't find any more blood, but instead you meet a towering figure, clad in iron garments resembling the features of a bull. It's Foreman Oyun. He wasn't locked up in the termitory with the rest of the kin after all. Instead he's been out searching the steppe for an aurochs, an ancient bull of the steppe created in Boss Turok's image, and whose body is said to have miraculous qualities. After many days of searching though, he's come up empty-handed, and it seems that the last of them have now passed from the earth. As for the miraculous blood, he claims that it leaked from the abattoir, and it's heavily implied that it came from a creature like the aurochs. Unfortunately though, he warns it will take some time before he can gain access to it for Artemy. You can also try to ask him about the Udurg on your father's list, but he stonewalls you, instead urging Artemy to first exert himself within the kin and learn their ways anew. For the next few days, you end up prowling the streets, trying to keep in the Inquisitor's favour until Oyun will let you into the abattoir. You also learn that the plague has infiltrated the termitory, and after the Inquisitor forcibly orders Vlad to open it, you discover that most of the 7,000 kin members inside are already dead. Amongst them is Overseer Tycheek, robbing you of another lead on your father's killer. Worse still, in the days ahead, what remains of the kin splits into two factions, those who wish for Artemy to take over his father's position, and those who reject him as unworthy. During the same time, you learn more about Isidor and his role in the town, and your picture of who he was grows more complicated. Both the townsfolk and members of the kin speak of Isidor as a wise man and healer, a man who helped give direction and purpose to his people, but also one who was willing to resort to harsh measures to ensure their survival.
Isidor tore this town to pieces.
A man who made severe judgments. A sawbones, as it were. Yes, sir. If the bones grew wrong, he broke them.
Oh, how his son tries to sew it back together. Maybe he'll succeed. And with pretty stitches.
Most shockingly, you learn that there was a previous outbreak of the plague in the town some 5 years ago. Despite his best efforts, your father failed to find a cure, and instead he made a horrifying decision to save the rest of the town. Barricading off the district where the plague first arose, he sacrificed the lives of the hundreds of people within, letting the plague burn itself out. Some of the townsfolk laud him as a saviour for doing this, whilst others consider him a monster. Either way, it's a hell of a thing to have on your conscience. That's also the reason that Murky claims to hate Artemy when you talk to her. Her parents were amongst the people Isidor locked in the district. Yeah, that's understandable. If you also take the time to talk to Aspity and the other members of the kin, then you realise that something big is coming. On certain nights, its members gather at Aspity's place, and she encourages Artemy to spend time with them and help solve their problems. By talking with them, you learn of the oppressive feeling the town has imposed on their identity, and how its language has begun to distort their own culture. Now there are words and concepts in their minds alien to their way of life, words and concepts that they did not wish to know. Instead, they yearn to return to the communal, beast-like state they knew before they were subjugated by Big Vlad and the town. In line with this, they begin to talk cryptically about an uprising, and it's clear that as the plague grows in intensity, they intend to flood the town and drive out its other residents, throwing off their enslavement and restoring the ways of the past. Yeah, the kin are a really cool and well-realised faction. I've not really encountered another that feels this primordial in terms of their practices and members. Part of them feels truly ancient and unknowable, like visually they're almost what I'd expect if I took a time machine back thousands of years ago in this region. And if you know about some of the Neolithic steppe cultures from this part of the world, yeah, there are a few parallels to be found to their ways of life. Despite their background being so unknowable though, they also have some very clear motivations. They hate the town because it's slowly killing them, warping their ancient beliefs and form of existence into something new and unwanted. It's hard not to empathise with someone who's having their very identity altered against their wishes. What really intrigued me about them though is that outside of being interesting from a design and lore standpoint, their traditions and overall plight have parallels with aspects of real-world Russian history. Yeah, Pathologic 2 is a Russian game after all. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in Russian history, but whilst I was first playing this game, I was recommended a book titled Village Life in Late Tsarist Russia by friend of the channel and fellow YouTuber Byron Lewis. This book chronicles the observations of its author, Olga Semyonova Tianshanskaya, of peasant life in a number of villages in Ryazan province during the late 19th century and early 20th century. Reading through it, I started to see some real parallels with the lifestyles of Russian peasants during this period. Going by Tianshanskaya's notes, they had a similar communal approach to wealth and status, where both were seen as a fixed quantity that couldn't be expanded, but only could be taken from someone else. So if someone came into some wealth, even if it was acquired honestly, it was often seen as a theft from the community as a whole. The brutal treatment of women during the period is also mirrored by the way that the herd brides are treated in the story, including by Artemy himself at one point. You can also draw parallels between the mixture of the town's ways and those of the kin with the continuing prevalence of folk rituals amongst the ostensibly orthodox Christian peasantry of the time. These parallels include such details as oaths being marked by eating soil, the belief in the existence of different nature sprites, and perhaps most directly, the veneration of folkloric figures such as Mat Zemlya, a creator entity also fittingly known as Moist Mother Earth. The diminishing of the kin's identity over the course of the game can also be seen as analogous to historical policies such as Russification and Russianization. These programs sought to homogenize the cultural identities of the nation's many ethnic and religious minorities, particularly its Turkic and Muslim populations, and were pursued by several Tsars during the late Russian Empire and during periods of the Soviet Union. Whilst we're on the topic, there's also a whole bunch of other parallels that can be made to different parts of Russian and Soviet history. Like how the Inquisitors feel very influenced by the various different intelligence agencies that the state employed after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. You're also told throughout the game that there's a war on, apparently, and some of the events during the latter part of the game feel very similar to the chaos of the Eastern Front during parts of World War I and II. And outside of Russia, you can also see parallels to the long history of Western colonization, including elements such as indentured servitude and slavery, the fetishization of indigenous women, and the subjugation of local customs and political structures in favor of the colonists' preferred way of controlling things. I've chosen not to go into all this in detail because, well, I think someone could probably write a decent PhD thesis on all this, but I just wanted to bring them all up in case you weren't aware of these aspects of history and wanted to look into them yourself. To To drag this all back to the kin, the attitudes of the non-kin townsfolk during the game towards them are also often seen to mirror the attitudes of historical Russian elites towards the peasantry, who they saw as a childlike populace who required the oppressive guidance of landlords to prevent them from being taken advantage of. Figures such as Big Vlad speak dismissively of the kin as lazy, describing them as animals in need of discipline. And whilst his son Vlad Jr. talks of reform and preserving their unique traditions, it's clear that any future he envisions for them is one with his own boot on their necks. Yeah, I haven't really spoken about this guy at all, but I started to get bad vibes from him almost immediately. There's something really off-putting about the way he fetishizes the practices of the kin and its members. It reminds me of the way that real-world colonial officials and ethnologists would excitedly document indigenous customs while still actively pursuing policies that contributed to their destruction. I wasn't surprised when later on he turns out to be the guy responsible for the shutting down of the termitary and the deaths of the people within. Yeah, turns out he knew the plague was already in there. Outside of him and his father, even the kin's leaders speak of their people in similar terms, seeing them as a beast with many heads that needs a strong hand to direct it. As you talk to Aspity and Oyun, it becomes increasingly clear that they expect you to provide that guiding hand, which they believe their people need to prevent the extinction of their ways. In line with this thinking, they urge you to crush the dissenters within the kin, so that they can be unified for their uprising to commence. Over time though, you begin to ask yourself, is Artemy this iron leader they crave? Is taking up your father's mantle really the right course of action? And if you let the kin flood the town, what will happen to the rest of its townsfolk, the ones you're fighting so hard to save? Surely there's a better way to resolve all this, right? Alongside this, you have to watch as the Inquisitor grows frustrated with the lack of progress. After a few days, it becomes clear that despite her fearsome introduction, she's just as trapped as you are. Whilst Inquisitors have a lot of power to solve problems, she confides in you that she isn't in good standing with the powers that be, and that if she fails here, then she will most likely face execution. To make matters worse, her orders weren't just to stop the plague, but also to preserve the town and all of its miracles, a task that now seems impossible. Over time, she grows increasingly desperate, and her suspicions begin to turn towards the polyhedron. Increasingly, she views it as an abomination, a miracle that perverts the laws of nature and must be responsible for the plague. After all, the first outbreak did coincide with its construction. Alongside all of this, something unexpected occurs. When you first meet Aglaia, she attempts to interrogate Artemy like she has the rest of the townsfolk, asking him a series of seemingly irrelevant questions to help her attune to his nature and weaknesses. Artemy, however, refuses to go along with it, either ignoring her questions or giving deliberately frustrating answers. This in turn leaves the Inquisitor baffled. She's a spider, used to having the flies in her web dance and squirm to try and appease her. Then she encounters Artemy, a man completely uninterested in her games, who will not desist from pursuing his goals regardless of who is attempting to manipulate him or what threats the Inquisitor holds over him. As you interact with her, she continues to cajole you into pursuing her objectives, threatening you with force unless you produce the answers she's relying on. The game also plays her up hard as a threat outside of your direct interactions, showing you the brutal eagerness with which she sends regular townsfolk to the gallows, and her all-consuming obsession with betrayal. Over time though, these threats start to feel more like an act. Increasingly, she speaks to Artemy as if he's a colleague, confiding in him her worries for her immediate future, and hinting that he is different in some way from the other people she's encountered. Throughout this all, you're not entirely sure what her game is, until you get to day 10. I mentioned in my last video that you sometimes get to interact with these figures known as tragedians, who sometimes represent characters' shadows and relate their inner feelings. Late in the game, you get to meet Aglaia's shadow, and only then do you realise what's happened. The Inquisitor has fallen in love with Artemy, entranced by the first person she's met who seems to be absolutely free. This also happens in the original Pathologic, but there it's presented as this eureka moment, where something about Artemy's manner and outlook on life breaks through her preconceived notions. That did work there, mostly because you'd probably sat through multiple days of her threatening the Bachelor by the time this happens, but I prefer the subtler way it's handled in Pathologic too. Then on day 9, Oyun finally lets you into the abattoir. You spent days waiting to find out what's going on inside, wondering anxiously if it contains more of the strange blood you need. Once Oyun finally gives you the go-ahead, you race on over there, and it's a sort of stealth combat section where you try to collect blood as you take on a bunch of strong enemies in some cramped tunnels. If I'm being honest, this is one of the few sections of the game that I found to be a bit of a letdown. It's a shame too. I mean, finally getting into the abattoir is clearly meant to be a major high point in the story. A lot of its design and atmosphere is still intriguing, but personally, I preferred the interior of the abattoir in Pathologic 1. In that game, the abattoir was a different beast entirely. Instead of being a bunch of cramped tunnels, it's this gigantic beehive of a structure, full of high ceilings and crudely separated into chambers and passages of unknown purpose. The longer I look at this place, the more questions come to mind. Like, how did these rocks get in here? They don't match the rest of the walls, and they're too wide to have been brought in through the entrance. What's the point of these pits, and why is there a walkway above them that goes nowhere? We're told that this place used to be a temple before it was an abattoir, and there is an altar, but why is it squirreled away in this little corner passage? I mean, yeah, the place looks a whole lot cruder than the Pathologic 2 abattoir, and it mostly just functions as a place you walk through to talk to one guy. There's something about this cruder version though that really opens up my imagination. It gives me the same vibes I get from the presumably ritual structures that archaeologists have found in early human settlements in the Middle East. If you're at all familiar with some of these, you'll know that they could also verge on the incomprehensible. Like, hey, in the 8th millennia BCE, these guys built a big underground chamber, covered it over and separated it into these little cells, might have used part of it to store grain, and then when they were done, they put a decapitated body on the floor and set fire to the whole thing. Huh. Whatever they were doing, they apparently thought it was important. This almost definitely wasn't intentional, but I found that these similar vibes to real-world ritual architecture helped the culture of the kin feel even more timeless and unknowable than before. Honestly, I think the way that Pathologic 1 dealt with the abattoir was just so much better. If you ask around town, you get all sorts of conflicting details about its origins, and it's clear that its exact age is a matter of some debate. According to some townsfolk, its construction dates back to the Neolithic, as do the practices of the kin, or perhaps it dates from a time before men ever came to be. According to others, however, it's only 80 years old, though this may simply have been when the town sprung up around it. If you believe the townsfolk, it used to be taller too, twice as tall as it is now. Questions upon questions. What also makes me dislike the Pathologic 2 abattoir is that this section of the game takes away all the resources and weapons you've gathered up until this point and forces you into using hand-to-hand combat against some of the strongest enemies in the game. My preferred strategy up until this point in the game had just been to avoid hand-to-hand combat altogether. In the rare moments when I get cornered or forced into a quest where violence was the only option, then I'd let my gun do the talking. So by the time I hit this section, I'd basically forgotten how most of the hand-to-hand combat worked. Each time I'd die over and over again as I misjudged my opponent's reach and ended up getting beaten to death. You do get a weapon partway through which helps somewhat, but only at the cost of doing something truly nightmarish. Then as soon as you get past the tunnels, the game immediately redeems itself. You find your way into the abattoir's central chamber, home to a sacrificial table and a massive circular pit that descends deep into the earth below. Looking at the thick bloodstains that coat its sides, you realise that in line with their belief that the earth needs to be nourished, the people of the kin have been pouring the blood of the miraculous aurochs into this pit for centuries, if not millennia, forming a living river that runs beneath the town and the surrounding steppe. Now it's up to you to try and find a way to unleash it and use it to cure the town. Okay, this is an awesome payoff. You complete another ritual on the nearby altar, then throw yourself into the pit itself. After falling through darkness, you come to a place that may or may not be real, comprised of glistening, flesh-like tunnels threading their way through the earth. After recovering your senses, you make your way through them, accompanied only by the sound of your own wet footsteps and a faint beating rhythm. Finally, you stumble upon a vast living heart. In that moment, you realise that this is what the final name on your list symbolises. The Udurg, the metaphorical heart of the earth and the kin, a single being that contains all others, created by the miraculous blood of the aurochs. Above it towers the great spike on which the polyhedron balances, a miracle of modernity piercing the earth to strike at the ancient miracles of the steppe. On the surface, this resembles the relationship between these two structures presented in the Haruspex playthrough of Pathologic 1. Here the polyhedron is depicted as a monstrous, almost parasitic entity, slicing through the flesh of the world bull that symbolises the Earth, with its resulting pain being one explanation for the plague's origin. In Pathologic 2, however, the wound is seemingly clotted, and now the polyhedron poses no threat to the ways of the kin. In fact, it's starting to look like the fates of the two may be intertwined, and any harm to the polyhedron risks the destruction of the Udurg. After escaping back to the town, you inform the Inquisitor of this, but all it does is harden her heart against the polyhedron further. She's already decided that it's to blame for the plague, and even if it's not, then destroying it and its associated miracles would make a fitting revenge against the powers that be for dispatching her to this unsolvable town. It's now clear that unless you find some way to thwart her, it's only a matter of time before she embarks upon both it and the Udurg's destruction. Around the same time, Oyun drops a bombshell on you. The person responsible for the outbreak was your father. He and Simon Kane dug that hole in the steppe to purposefully unleash the pain of the living earth from underground in the form of the plague, infecting themselves and Tycheek in the process. And now, thanks to his actions, thousands of people are dead. In another dream sequence, you get to quiz Isidor yourself, and you learn that he and Simon were convinced there was something wrong with the town, that it was a misshapen chimera, comprised of irreconcilable parts that needed to be broken apart and bound together again to prevent its extinction. He himself was only able to begin the process of tearing open the town's wounds, but he hoped that his son would be the one to bind them up again. After all, who better to do it than Artemy, a chimera himself, born of a man of the kin and a woman of the town? And that's one of the remaining conundrums that Artemy faces as the game barrels inevitably to a climax. How best is he to take up his father's legacy, to wrap himself in Isidor's sins and bind up the town anew? Around the same time, the game begins its final escalation. On the morning of Day 9, worried by the Inquisitor's lack of progress, the powers that be send in the army. Now armed troops patrol the streets, shooting criminals and the infected alike. With them they've brought a massive cannon, primed and ready to fire. All they lack is a target and the orders to act, something within the Inquisitor's power to give. Over time, the army also starts to fall victim to the plague too, which kills a big chunk of their men and causes a bunch of units to rebel and try to overthrow their commander. Their arrival and resulting degeneration is presented as a last major ramp-up in the plot, marking the point where the little remaining semblance of order in the town gives way to anarchy. In terms of gameplay though, this actually makes things a little easier. Now instead of having to worry about armed goons as you wander the street, most of them are too busy fighting the army to pay you much attention. Just don't let your reputation get too low or your infection too high, as the soldiers will absolutely wreck you if they do. They do come with one hidden benefit though. If you end up getting infected and are the gambling type, then you can try and let their flame troopers burn the infection out of you. If you're lucky, you might even manage it before your health runs out. And amongst this anarchy, you finally track down your father's killer. After finding a way to resolve the rift in the kin, either by crushing the dissenters as Oyun and Aspity demanded, or by finding a peaceful conclusion to their conflict, you help them escape the Termitary and Big Vlad's grasp. If you like, you can even leave him or his weird son to enjoy the mercy of his former slaves on the way out. Upon returning them to their ancient village in the steppe, the combined kin help you figure out the truth. It was Oyun. He killed your father, and he's been hiding it from you the whole time. So you grab the best weapon at your disposal and head into the bowels of the abattoir to confront him. Time to say hello to Mother Bodho, buddy. Oh god damn it! With the truth out in the open, Oyun confesses to your father's murder. It's here, however, that Pathologic 2 makes things a lot more interesting by giving him a chance to tell his side of the story. In the first game, his reasons for killing Isidor were pretty simple. After accidentally infecting himself, your father needed the miraculous Aurochs blood to craft a panacea, and he knew the only way he could get it was by taking over the kin. So he challenged Oyun for its leadership, and Oyun killed him. Oyun then tries to stop the plague himself by sacrificing another Aurochs, but his ritual fails, and fear of losing his position leads him to try and kill Artemy with a series of trials to become a Menku. By the time Artemy discovers the truth in that game, the only way to deal with Oyun is a duel to the death. This takes the form of a final boss fight, where all your weapons get taken away and you have to hit him 30 times whilst he kills you in only 4. It's bad. There is a better resolution in the Changeling playthrough, where Clara makes Oyun see the error of his ways and he voluntarily gives up both his position to Artemy and his life for the good of the town. But everything he does up until that point is motivated by his own self-interest. In Pathologic 2, however, Oyun's reasons are more complicated. Oyun didn't kill Isidor to preserve his own position. In fact, your father never challenged him at all. Instead, he came across your father after he and Simon had already unleashed the plague. Learning what Isidor had done and thinking that his friend had gone mad, he claims that he killed him to spare him from a far more painful death at the hands of the plague that was already ravaging his body, and in the hope of preventing it from spreading to the rest of the town. And that's kind of an understandable response. Personally, I don't know how I would react if I was just presented with such a nightmare scenario out of nowhere. Oyun also doesn't really do anything that malicious towards Artemy in Pathologic 2. Yes, he does hide his role in your father's death, and he does send you into the abattoir, but he gives you a fairly stark warning as to the dangers to expect. By the time you confront him, he's already accepted that his death is inevitable in order to make way for Artemy. His last act is to help craft the powerful new leader he believes his people need to help them flood the town and throw off the shackles of modernity. Instead of a janky boss fight, you're given an honest choice as to how to deal with Oyun's actions. To decide whether to forgive him for what he considered an act of mercy against a man whose own actions have since led to the deaths of many townsfolk and most of the kin, or to satisfy your desire for revenge. Honestly, I found myself choosing to forgive him more often than not, giving us both a chance to move on. So we've finally tracked down our father's killer, decided how best to exact our revenge, and it seems like we're within a stone's throw of solving the plague outbreak. Surely now there's nothing to stop us plowing through the last couple of in-game days and finally finishing the main plot. Except, what if this isn't actually the main plot? What if, like Oyun, I've been hiding the truth from you the whole time? If you've never played this game, then you might have thought that what I've been describing sounds like a pretty convincing plot for a game. A weird one, granted, but a plot nonetheless. The reality, however, is that something very different is actually going on in Pathologic 2. Because the game didn't start back in the train yard on day one. It started here. So, yeah, we should probably talk about that, huh? Let's make something clear. Pathologic 2 isn't a game about a plague outbreak. Pathologic 2 is a game about a play about a plague outbreak. You're not playing as Artemy Burak, you're playing as an actor who is playing Artemy Burak. This becomes apparent from the moment you begin the game, when you're treated to the failed results of your last performance. After appearing backstage in a theatre full of bodies, you stumble out into the streets of a burning town overrun by the plague. There's barricades and furniture strewn across the streets, groups of soldiers with flamethrowers burning anything that gets near, prisoners being summarily executed. The 7 children of fate lie dead, the kin has been destroyed, and there's no time left to produce a cure. It's day 12, and you've already lost. This whole sequence is fantastic, easily one of the best introductions I've ever seen in a game. If you've played Pathologic 1, you'll know that this is basically a remake of the bad ending from that game, which is super cool to see play out. Personally, I like to think of this sequence as the canonical ending of that game, if the main characters have been left to their own devices without the player around to help them out. So in addition to being a reimagining of the first game, it also might be a direct sequel to its worst possible outcome. Throughout this sequence, you're introduced to the figure of Mark Immortal, the head of the theatre. In Pathologic 1, he was also in charge of the town's theatre, and honestly, he doesn't do much. He is implied to know more about what's going on than it might seem, but nothing really comes of it. In Pathologic 2, however, he's been elevated to something of an omnipotent trickster figure, one who critiques your performance and is implied to control your fate. Once you finish stumbling through the town, you eventually end up in the cathedral. After being dismissed by both the Inquisitor and the commander of the army which shows up on day 9, Mark reappears and offers you a do-over, and this second performance is the actual game I've been describing. As to what he wants from all this, besides putting on a good performance, well, who's to say? As you play through the second performance, he also shows up on occasion to offer his thoughts on how things are going. Over time, you get the sense that he's watching your every move, and you've no idea why. He even keeps tabs on you when you're dead. Yeah, it turns out death isn't the instant game over that I initially thought in part 1. If you run out of health, then instead of it being a hard game over like in Pathologic 1, you get teleported to the town's theatre for a moment, where Mark and other characters occasionally appear and critique your performance so far. In a huge dick move, your maximum survival bars also get permanently reduced a little each time you die. Yeah, fuck you, game. There's also another consequence for dying that seems bad, but exactly how bad is uncertain. If you die enough times, then instead of being greeted by Mark, then instead this woman appears on the stage. She asks you if you've seen a rat around, and accidentally lets slip that this place is called the Theatre of Death. Yeah, fitting. It turns out that this rat is some sort of demon associated with the theatre, which might have escaped because we left the door unlocked whilst returning to the real world. You know, that is funny, because on day 1, Artemy had a bad dream where he met this weird guy called the Rat Prophet on top of one of the town's impossible structures. But that was just a stress dream, right? Nope, turns out he's a real problem that you might really have to deal with. If you die a lot in this game, which, spoiler warning, you will, then he starts to appear outside the town's theatre. He's surprisingly convivial by the standards of most of the stranger entities you meet in these games, though he does express some frustration at your performance. What's far more concerning though is that over time, something he refers to as a tumour starts to erupt from the earth opposite the theatre. If you continue to play through the game and die a whole bunch more times, then it grows larger and larger, and soon evolves to resemble the bones of some giant beast. I don't know what that thing is, I don't know what the Rat Prophet has planned with it, and I don't want to know. Instead, I just focused on trying not to die so much that it got big enough to be a problem. So we might think that by just keeping Artemy alive, that would be enough to deal with our rat problem. Well, no, we actually have another one to deal with, one that has the ear of someone genuinely powerful. Yeah, I didn't mention it before, but on top of the rulers of the town and the powers that be, there's another group of authority in the town, the mistresses. These consist of charismatic women that inspire both awe and dread, and who also receive prophetic visions that help shape the town. In previous decades, these comprised of Victoria Olgimskaya, Big Vlad's wife, and Nina Kana, matriarch of the Kane family, with these two women acting as a sort of counterbalance to the power of the male members of their respective families. By the beginning of the game though, both of them are deceased. Sort of. Look, it's not entirely clear. As their respective daughters, Capella and Maria, are apparently still too young to assume their mother's roles, this burden is instead placed on a sole mistress, Katerina Sabirova, who is the wife of the town's governor Alexander. By the time you meet her though, it's clear that she's starting to fall apart under the stress of the position, and is already nursing a pretty gnarly morphine addiction. Later on, however, it's revealed that she isn't a true mistress, and instead she's been getting her prophetic visions from the whispers of the Rat Prophet. When you confront it though, this time it's different. Where before it resembled a fairly understandable anthropomorphic rat, this thing feels wrong. It's all hunched over and legless, its eyes are misty and infinite, and there's also this fucking awful music that plays when it appears that makes being around it extremely off-putting. Similar to many of the other entities in the game, it mostly just berates you for your lack of understanding. If you ask it about the Rat Prophet's actions from before though, it denies having any knowledge of that creature, and instead claims to be another manifestation of the Earth. Later on, it also shows up at the cemetery, trying to cut a deal with you to help get rid of the town's overflowing population of corpses. If you want my advice, don't take the deal, or the other one that the game offers you. Trust me, if you play up to this point, you'll know which one I mean. Maybe this is all still the Rat Prophet messing with us, or maybe it's something to do with the plague, but either way, this all seems very concerning. I certainly have some concerns. Unfortunately though, there's not much we can do about him going forwards. Outside of these meta elements, there's also other figures who pull similar stunts connected to the Theatre of Death. I already discussed the Tragedians and the Executors in part 1, who each have a habit of bypassing Artemy and talking to the player directly. Each night the game also puts on a play at the town's theatre, which acts as a commentary on the day's events and the actions of the player. Sometimes it even stars Artemy himself, whilst you playing Artemy sit and watch. Late in the game, you also get a chance to meet the understudy for your part. He's kind of a dick, to be honest. This framing device might be a little meta for some folks, but I personally found it really cool. In addition to adding an extra layer of mystery to everything, it also means that there's multiple moments in the game where you're not quite sure who exactly the game is talking to, the character of the Haruspex or the actor behind him. I'm not breaking any new ground here with my analysis, but a term that often gets thrown around when describing these elements of Pathologic 2 is Brechtian, in reference to the works of the early 20th century German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on Brecht or the brand of epic or dialectic theatre he helped pioneer. I have seen a production of the Threepenny Opera, and I did read through a book of his essays prior to writing this video. I mean, I didn't understand most of it, but I did indeed read it. My very basic understanding is that this brand of theatre deliberately aims to create a sense of alienation between the player and its audience, forcing them to think critically about the themes and societal issues it raises, rather than simply treating it as a story. This is accomplished through a number of elements designed to prevent the audience from suspending its disbelief. Common techniques for this include deliberately breaking the fourth wall, interacting with the audience, and having actors distance themselves emotionally from their roles, and even openly switch parts. And yeah, I can see parallels to how Pathologic 2 treats its players. On top of all the other jabs at breaking the fourth wall that I've mentioned so far, there's also some more subtle stuff. Like how one way you can interpret the Inquisitor being entranced by Artemy is because she senses that he's the only person actually being puppeted by a real human being. At the end of the game though, any sense of the fourth wall staying intact gets shattered completely when its developers drive a bus through it. Yeah, the people at Icepick Lodge themselves show up to comment on the game. Pathologic 1 did this as well, allowing you to interview the developers in the guise of NPCs and get their thoughts and insights on the characters and what they expected from you as a player. Pathologic 2 denies you such a direct interrogation, and instead gives you a little insight into everyone involved in making the game. How they did this is I think they gave each member of their team an NPC and let them write whatever they wanted for their dialogue. Some of them used this space to comment on their experience making the game, others wrote something cryptic, and one person even wrote a weird little poem. It's quite good actually. It's a lot of fun to see these people enshrine their opinions within the art they've crafted. This might all sound extremely pretentious though, and you're right. In fact, it's so pretentious that one of the devs even calls out the game for being too pretentious about its fourth wall breaking. Are you even being serious? But just like its predecessor, within the universe the game constructs, these pretensions feel organic, and they're part of what makes the Pathologic experience so unique. Alongside its meta elements, there's also a distinct sense of Brechtian alienation in how Pathologic 2 presents the game's characters. You do empathise with Artemy a little, given that he's the viewpoint character, but there's moments in the plot where regardless of how you play him, he's still willing to resort to some horrific methods to get the answers he needs. By comparison, there's very little to empathise with about some of its cast. Whilst most of them still feel like flesh and blood people, there are certain characters who feel more like puzzles to be solved. Even those that do come across as nice and empathetic have a bad habit of blotting their copybook later on in a way that makes you wonder if you ever really knew them at all. A good example of this is Lara Ravel, the nice woman who takes in Artemy on day one. When you first meet her, she seems quite reserved and gloomy. She's still grieving over the recent death of her father, to the point where she's closed off the wings of her house where he used to live. Still, this hasn't overcome her natural empathy for other people, and she spends most of the game either trying to straighten out Artemy's affairs or trying to put together a shelter for people to escape the plague. That is, until the army arrives in town, at which point she buys a gun and tries to murder its commander. Yeah, that came out of left field, right? Well, no actually, not completely. I thought this the first time playing, but on my second time through, I realised the game sets this up a little in literally the first conversation you have with her. Here you learn that her father was an army man, and that he died under unclear circumstances the previous year. Then later in the game, after the army shows up, you learn that her father was actually executed on trumped-up charges by their commander Alexander Bloch, and by the time you find this out, she's already en route to his headquarters to get revenge. If you catch up with her in time, then you do manage to talk her out of it, but if you don't, then she goes through with her murder attempt and ends up being arrested and executed for it. Is this portraying the inner darkness of someone who is outwardly kind and empathetic, which she would have allowed to destroy her if Artemy wasn't around? Or is this the story of a good person whose grief caused her to make a stupid decision, whose past kindness to the Haruspecs is repaid by him helping her out of her own dark moments of the soul? It's up to the audience to decide which. So I guess that just about wraps up everything pretentious I have to say about Pathologic 2. Oh wait, there is one more thing. We forgot to finish the game. So, back to the play, you've now solved your father's murder and dealt with Oyun. But what about that whole plague thing? Well, around the same time, the game's final boss hits. On day 10, the plague makes a final desperate roll of the dice, breaking its own rules and infecting the 7 children on whom your father believed the town's future rests. It's up to you to harness everything you've learned up until this point, to scrounge up every potion and cure at your disposal to keep them alive. I know I mentioned this in my last video as one of the many moves the game makes to pile pressure on the player towards the game's end, but in isolation, it's a fantastic final challenge for you to overcome. It isn't a traditional final boss, but it works the exact same way that the ideal boss fight should, acting as a final exam for everything you've learnt in the game. On top of anyone else who might already be infected, you have to use all of your Menku's skills to keep these children alive, either by brewing enough panaceas to cure them, by having enough schmauders set aside so that you won't need to, or failing both, keeping their infection levels under control and hoping they make it to day 11. Managing all this, when you're already juggling every other system I mentioned in the last video, well, I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot. Talking to some of these kids is also genuinely harrowing, given you've spent the entire game getting to know them and might never have seen some of them infected before. The worst one by far though is Murky. Unless she died before, this is the only time in the game that she can get infected. Where the rest of the kids are confused, trying to put a brave face on things, or even offer to martyr themselves to save the others, she calmly requests that you bury her in her favourite spot. When you ask if she still hates you, she confesses that despite what your father did to her parents, she never actually hated Artemy. Instead, she loved him from the moment she set eyes on him. It's conversations like these in the latter part of the game that really add an additional emotional catharsis to the one that you get from managing to save as many people as you can. If you manage to save all the children, or heaven forbid everyone in your bound, then congratulations, it is a genuine achievement to get this far without losing someone along the way. But even after you've found your father's murderer, thwarted the plague and saved as many people as possible, Pathologic 2 still denies you closure. Elsewhere on day 10, the Inquisitor puts her final plan into motion. Growing increasingly fearful of the rebellious army, she begs Artemy to abandon following in his father's footsteps and flee the town with her in defiance of their respective fates. You can choose whether to go with her or not, but regardless of which choice you make, it doesn't end well for Aglaia. Before she is killed though, she dispatches 3 couriers, each carrying orders for the army to shoot down the polyhedron. Day 11 then sees Artemy being given a final choice. After frantically searching across the town, you discover that none of the couriers made it to the army's commander alive. In the end, Artemy is left holding the last surviving set of orders, and with them the fate of the town itself. On one hand, you can choose to enact the Inquisitor's final revenge and deliver them, destroying the polyhedron and releasing the river of blood the changeling prophesied you'd spill. You're told that this will stop the plague and provide enough miraculous blood to make countless panaceas. The cost will be turning your back on the kin, destroying the Udurg, and with it all the peoples and miracles of the steppe. On the other hand, you can choose to burn the orders, preserving the polyhedron along with the kin and their miracles, but leaving the future of the townsfolk uncertain as the plague runs amok. No matter which of these choices you make, someone or something will have to be cut away for the town to be made whole again. I guess that loading screen from the last video was right. You can't save everyone. If you choose to deliver the orders, destroying the polyhedron and unleashing the living blood of the earth, then on the surface, everything seems fine. The plague disappears, the surviving townsfolk are saved, and there's plenty of panacea around to cure anyone who was infected. In a vast improvement over Pathologic 1's endings, where all you got was a short clip showing you the consequences of your decision, here you actually get to walk around the town and talk to the survivors in the aftermath. The plague clouds and burned over districts are gone, the sky's clear, and all your hunger, exhaustion, and worries of the last few days are finally lifted. Walking around is like a big sigh of relief knowing that all the trouble with the plague is behind you and you never have to do it again. The survivors start to rebuild the town, the children on your father's list discuss how best to decide its future, and the budding mistresses Capella and Maria prepare to take up their mother's roles. Artemy adopts both Murky and Sticky as his children, you all move back into your father's house, and all's well that ends well. Except, not really. The thing is, the more I walked around the town and talked to people, the more things started to feel off to me. By the end of the game, you're so used to the skies being overcast, polluted either by the plague clouds or the strange off-colouring of the burned over districts, that it honestly felt a little surreal to see the town with sunny skies. What's also remarkable is just how sinister the town manages to feel even with its negative aspects seemingly swept away. It's a credit to the art design. It's like you've arrested the rot before the town was destroyed, but the damage that's already been done is irrevocable. Honestly, to me, this whole experience of walking around the town and catching up with everyone began to feel kinda harrowing. If you chose to spare him, then talking to Oyun in particular really recontextualizes a few things. Here's this guy that you may have honestly forgiven for his crimes, accepting that he did what he did because he wanted to save your father and others from a truly nightmarish death from the plague. Instead, you decide to give both of you the chance to move on, even if he doesn't seem ready to do so himself. Give him some time though, I'm sure he'll come around. But by sparing Oyun's life, then making the conscious decision to destroy the kin, that crosses into villain territory for me. You're leading him on, sparing his life and acting like you've forgiven him, then you destroy everything and everyone he's ever cared about, leaving him to live in a world where he knows he has no purpose. This goes double for Aspity. If you talk to her, it turns out she might well have been the Shabnakadir from the beginning, or at least a creature born from the earth in the aftermath of the first outbreak to embody your father's sins. And thanks to your actions, she and the rest of the kin are now doomed to die and fade away. Now Twire no longer buds on the steppe, the abattoir and the termitary fall silent, and an ancient way of life is gone forever. Congratulations, Artemy, you saved the town, but only by cutting away a part of your soul. Enjoy. Before we end here today then, let's take a look at the other ending. Back to day 11, instead of delivering the orders, you either throw them in a nearby fire or wait until it's too late for them to matter. Without any cure, the plague runs amok, driving out the army and the few people that remain. With the earth soothed by their departure, the surviving members of the kin rise up and flood the town, whilst the plague itself is rendered harmless. At the polyhedron, a new ruling triumvirate of mistresses are inaugurated: Tyre, mistress of bulls, Grace, mistress of the dead, and the changeling, mistress of the earth. The miracles of the old world and the new combine, and the great aurochs of the past are revived once more. Finally, you assume your place as the Iron Ruler of the kin, taking the town back to the days when the abattoir was twice as tall. In this ending, you manage to save the kin, but at the cost of almost all the people in the story that you fought so hard to preserve. You get a chance to talk to them as they flee the town, and it's like they're in a fog, unsure of who you are or what's happening to them. You can try to urge them to remain, but it's clear that there's no place for them in the kin's domain. Instead, they wander out into the steppe, and it's implied that they go to their deaths. In the end, no matter what choice Artemy makes, he's doomed to some form of failure, unable to reconcile his dual heritage as a man of both the kin and the town. All he can do is cut one half away and try to survive with what he has left. Or maybe he doesn't, because remember, this is all just a play. Regardless of which outcome you pick, you end up back in the theatre, where Mark Immortal comments on your performance. You did good, mostly. Apparently your performance let them get some great observations. Who are they, you ask? Another good question. Mark still laments, though, that you were miscast in the role, and that a do-over with someone who actually fears death is more appropriate. Then you're faced with a few different options. If you like, you can choose to hang up the role and quietly exit through a side door, which after everything we've been through, I wouldn't blame you for choosing. Alternatively, you can choose to become the role and return to the world that you just saved. If you go back outside, the camera finally pops out of Artemy's head, and you're treated to a last glimpse of the opposing worlds you've created. In a fun little twist that harkens back to one of the endings of the original game, you're also given the option to tear down the fourth wall entirely, usurping Marker Mortal's position and revealing yourself as the player behind the actor. And there's nothing he can do to stop you. You're the player, a figure so powerful that this world can only continue to operate because you continue to play. You take control of the theatre, and Artemy turns into a tragedian and gives a final bow as the curtain falls. Then, regardless of what you choose, the game cuts to credits and we get the most unsettling piece of music yet. Yeah, this makes me feel like regardless of what option you choose, none of them are really a good ending. And isn't that just the most pathologic thing imaginable? Where other games are more concerned about giving people closure, this one leaves me with a growing sense that no matter what I did, I still screwed up somehow. Well, that's Pathologic 2. It's by far the most harrowing experience I've ever had playing a game, probably counts as torture under the Geneva Convention, and somehow managed to give me a sense of catharsis I've never really had elsewhere. And that's basically everything I had to say on the game. Or at least I thought it was, back when I was originally writing these videos. Then I took way longer to make them than I expected, and in that time the demo for Pathologic 3 came out, Quarantine. Yeah, you remember how in the last video I said that they conceived Pathologic 2 as a remake or sequel to all three of the original game's playthroughs? Well, due to various financial reasons, that didn't happen, but in the long term, they appear to be trying to make good on that promise, with Pathologic 3 covering the exploits of the Bachelor and his own struggle against the plague. Apparently, they're also planning to give it to anyone who backed the original Pathologic 2 Kickstarter for free, so it's nice to see that they're not shirking their responsibility there. I've since played through the demo a few times, and it looks promising. It's got a whole bunch of shenanigans involving what appears to be time travel, elements of reality breaking down, Twin Peaks of Return references in the achievements, all the good stuff you'd expect from a Pathologic game. It also seems to have clarified a question I had left over from Pathologic 2, which is, what would a non-Haruspex playthrough even look like mechanically? So much of the gameplay of Pathologic 2 was tied to the Haruspex' unique Menku abilities that it left me wondering what methods the Bachelor was going to use to try and save the town's inhabitants. Well, going by the demo, it looks like for most of them, the prickly prick isn't even going to try. Instead, it seems he's going to be focusing on making the vaccine he hinted at during Pathologic 2. This means only trying to save people who have yet to be infected, observing the ones who seem to be resilient to the plague's effects and diagnosing any symptoms they have, then harvesting their sweet delicious blood to help make a serum. And that sort of careful observation and problem solving feels right at home with the pre-existing Pathologic formula. It also looks like we're going to finally be seeing Dankovsky's lab back in the capital. Though, things don't seem to be going too well there. I'm looking forward to playing the full game when it comes out and seeing what horrors this entry in the Pathologic universe has lurking within it. Who knows, maybe in 5 years I'll make another video about it. And that's all my thoughts on the Pathologic series. For now, anyway. Thanks to everyone who checked out this video on the last one, by the way. I expected that the first one would get maybe a few hundred views, and maybe like 3 comments lifetime, but in the last few months, quite a few Pathologic fans ended up finding it after all. Originally, all I had planned for this channel was just to make these 2 videos, mostly because my brain decided that I had to make them before I could move on with my life. But after the positive reception of the last video, and hopefully this one too, I'll see about making a couple more. I think I've spent enough time with Pathologic 2 though. There's only so much you can say about the punishing sequel to an already horrifically cruel game that's roughly 50% jank. Next time, I'll try and tackle something a little bit more player-friendly. So on that note, I'm happy to announce the subject of my next video on this channel. Fear and Hunger 2.